The instability of our region remains one of the greatest challenges this country is facing. It affects our trade, our economy, the ability of Australian companies to expand internationally, and the global flow of capital. Complacency is not an option when it comes to our foreign policy. And whilst it may seem far removed from the lives of working Australians, the reality could not be further from the truth. If we are to maintain our close ties and friendships with nations across the world and continue to enjoy the benefits of fruitful trade agreements, we must have a smarter foreign policy process. This is necessary as we seek to safeguard our interests and support global prosperity, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. We are a small country compared with many of our regional neighbours, and if we are to be heard, we must speak with one voice. It is a strength of our democratic process that we engage in rigorous debate and allow for dissenting voices. However, we must also recognise that there is time for unity and solidarity when it comes to our engagement on the world stage. In Australia, we take open markets for granted. Most nations cannot. We take a free press as the assumed status quo. Most nations do not. We must therefore recognise that when it comes to supporting not only aspirational Australians but international trade and freedom, we cannot cut corners. We are part of this smarter foreign policy agenda. We must create a streamlined process where the best interests of Australians in all states and territories are looked after. This means not having contradictory memorandums of understanding coming out of different parts of Australia. It means ensuring that the academic integrity and high standards of our educational system are safeguarded. It means countries throughout the world know Australia as that light on a hill supporting democracy, freedom and enterprise. This bill will ensure that these ideals, which are at the core of Australia, are upheld and protected both here and around the world. The changing nature of the power structures shaping the international environment requires states and territories to be working closely with the Commonwealth Government. The relative peace and stability that has underpinned Australia's prosperity can no longer be taken for granted. As a nation, we are increasingly being required to forge our own path and to take leadership both in our region and in connection with specific issues. We are a young country, but there are many that are younger, more fragile and require strong leadership in times of uncertainty. Playing domestic politics on the world stage is a sure way to diminish our global effectiveness and strain important strategic relationships. The proposed legislation creates a streamlined process to resolve this issue. Australians are best served when we are able to represent ourselves with clarity concerning international agreements. It means not allowing ourselves to be vulnerable to divide and conquer tactics which some nations employ to pursue their own agendas. The process that this legislation creates is long overdue. It was assumed for many decades and by successive leaders that Australia's foreign policy was the exclusive domain of the Commonwealth Government, that had the resources, personnel, information and skills to make the right decision for all Australians. It is unfortunate that some state and local governments have made the choice to go beyond their jurisdictions, knowing full well that they do not have the relevant departmental and personnel to make these decisions. Australian voters do not go to the ballot box thinking their councillors or state members will be directing foreign policy of the entire nation, nor should they. And yet many have gone beyond their elected responsibilities and failed to provide even a modicum of transparency. Engaging in foreign policy should not be something that happens on an ad hoc basis by elected members without support from the relevant department or consultation with key stakeholders. Democracy is not about taking unilateral action or attempting to run a proxy foreign policy which serves the vested interests of a minority. The Commonwealth Government was elected by the people of Australia to represent their interests as a whole. The proposed legislation reflects not only the appropriate roles of government within Australia, but reinforces those responsibilities outlined in our Constitution. The economic stability of our nation is built on friendly relations with our neighbours. We rely on trade and enjoy close ties to much of the rest of the world. It is a testament to the successful foreign policy we have engaged in to date and our high standing internationally. If we want to continue to enjoy the benefits of strong international ties, we cannot afford to mix messages or contradictory agreements to be signed. This legislation creates a reliable framework for engaging with the rest of the world at a time when we need to be supporting jobs, growth and investment. Bills such as this support international confidence in our nation and help Australian businesses plan for the future. This is an important aspect of our economic recovery and building integrity into our systems at all levels of government. This bill instills consistency in how we deal with foreign governments. It ensures that our national interests come first, that no special interest groups or ideological cliques have the ability to pursue an agenda at odds with what is best for Australians. This bill is not about intruding into states and territories or trying to tell local governments how to operate. It is ensuring that in our dealings with foreign governments, our national interests and values are reflected, which put freedom and fairness at the heart of what we do. This bill does not affect engagement with corporations. This is a government that supports entrepreneurship and innovation, which are the foundation of our nation's economic prosperity and that of many other countries. This legislation requires that due diligence is given to international arrangements as an effective mechanism to support Australian interests globally. As part of this process, we are requiring the states, territories and local governments complete a stock take of international agreements that they have currently engaged in so that a review of these agreements can take place. A public register of these agreements will be created to ensure that there is a high level of transparency and any arrangements with foreign governments are open for the debate that makes this country strong. If it is found that some of the agreements are not in the best interests of all Australians, the Commonwealth Government retains the power to rescind the agreement or, if necessary, obtain an injunction in the Federal Court or High Court to enforce that decision. One of the telltale signs that this legislation is long overdue is that the Commonwealth has little to no oversight on many of the international agreements that the states and territories and councils have signed. This despite the fact that ultimate responsibility for foreign policy resides with the Commonwealth. Were relations with other countries to become a political football, it would seriously undermine both our international credibility but also our capacity to represent and defend the interests of Australians abroad. The instability of our region makes this simply dangerous and cannot benefit Australia in any way. The place for debate around foreign policy rests within the federal government. This legislation is targeted, with much of the normal business that is conducted being completely unaffected. As a government that supports free enterprise and innovation, the focus of this legislation is to create an environment which is conducive to business seeking to act fairly. Foreign policy requires a long-term vision for our strategic interests, which should not be dependent on state, territory or council interests. International relations remains one of the most challenging areas in our region, contains due to a number of hotspots which are the source of global tension. It is precisely because of the delicate nature of these flashpoints and the way in which other nations are operating which requires us to take a long-term view of our strategic interests. In support of peace and stability, we cannot allow the internal debates around our foreign policy agenda to be played out on the international stage. Parliament is the chamber for debate, and responsibility for foreign policy clearly rests with the Commonwealth Government, who takes a national view representing the interests of all. Australians, regardless of which state or territory, or indeed local government area that they come from. As part of the implementation of this legislation, engaging with key stakeholders is taking place. This is especially the case with universities who we understand may be uniquely affected by this bill. Over the long term, the increased cooperation will enable the full resources of the federal government to inform decision-making by states, territories, local governments and other organisations. Ultimately, this benefits working Australians by creating a healthy and transparent systems that impact how we do business both here and around the globe. For these reasons, Mr Deputy Speaker, I recommend this bill to the House.